All right, so we will call to order the October meeting of the Government Operations Committee. And the first thing that we have on our agenda today is to approve the minutes from the September 19th meeting. For a motion to do so.
Motion to approve.
I'll second.
All in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? No. All right. So with that done, we're gonna move on now to, back to our short-term rental discussion, that we started up last month. And, we're gonna hear from planning again.
Yeah, great. Good to be here tonight, GOC, in person, and thanks for all those watching from home. Brad Griffin, our planning director, is here today with us, and wasn't able to be here last time. So yes, y'all mentioned last time you want to talk a little bit about the zoning, and we plan to do that tonight. Our deputy attorney, Hines, has written a memo that y'all have received, and we're going to try to kind of frame today's discussion through the lens of some of the key points in that memo. And so we will talk about zoning throughout, and we're thankful for that memo. But in summary, what we're trying to do is talk about the definition of what a short-term rental is today. I think that's something we heard from y'all last time in emails, that we really need to kind of firm up that definition of short-term rentals. We're going to talk a little bit about zoning. We're going to talk a little bit about the difference between how finance talks about short-term rentals versus planning, as that was a question that came up. And we're also gonna, I think what something of value would be to really talk about these things through kind of three policy lenses. And those are some of those things we heard from y'all's goals last meeting, but the first one being nuisances. And so, that's something that potentially the software platform could handle if we were to do an RFP for that. We're going to think about the financial aspect, and then something we heard from y'all in terms of the impact on the supply of housing, right? So our short-term rental supply impacting that. But those are three lenses we can talk through, and Brad's here to answer any zoning-related questions as well. So with that, Attorney Hines, was there anything you wanted to start off with in particular?
Not necessarily. I don't know if you wanted to start. I think that's a good introduction. So yeah, where we like to go?
Go for it.
And let me just reiterate too, that if you guys did not have a chance to look at Attorney Hines' memo, please read it. Tons of information in there, and it really starts to weave together the complexities of what is short-term rental and how it interacts with zoning and vesting. I mean, there's just so many layers to this, and I think she did a really good job of showing different communities and their attempt to go in different directions with the regulatory side of it. And they've all got problems. They've all got issues with them that you've got to work through. But to me, from a zoning standpoint, first and foremost, our zoning ordinance, like most, if not almost all zoning ordinances, is silent on short-term rental. It just doesn't define it, never anticipated it when these ordinances were created. And so from a planning department standpoint, our approach when we receive phone calls and people wanting to know if they can do an Airbnb out of their house or out of an accessory cottage, what we have been telling them for a long time is that we can't give you permission to do it, but we also cannot give you a letter or anything in writing saying it's not permitted because the ordinance is silent on it. And so that's kind of the quandary we find ourselves in now, as it relates to the number of units that we know are out there that are going to have, just based on case law that's occurred throughout the state, those units are going to get some level of vesting. And how we approach that and how we handle it long term is ultimately policy decisions that we've got to make. But I think the biggest issue from a zoning standpoint, as we begin to get into the weeds a little bit with this, really kind of four big things: the what, the where, the how, and how do we go about vesting. In terms of the what is it that we as a community want to accomplish with? At some point you've got to put something in the zoning ordinance that refers to short-term rentals. And what does that look like? What types of units do you want it to regulate? Are there some that you don't? If it's a situation where you don't have necessarily an issue perhaps with somebody who owns a house occasionally renting an ADU in their backyard. That's different than somebody buying an investment property with no intent of ever living there, but simply using it as, a short-term rental. It impacts on the neighborhood and surrounding property owners. And so those are kind of two opposite ends of the spectrum that we really need to kind of start to narrow that down before we set a definition in place to then start working off where should you allow it, under what conditions should you allow it. That gets into the where, do we want it across the board? Some of the communities that have adopted ordinances, including, I believe, the one that the mayor sent out today, which was Newton County, Henry County. Henry looks like they just said you can do them. You can have this many of them, you can do them, here are the requirements. Did not appear, based on me reading that ordinance today, that it established any zones where it were or were not permitted.
I think it only allowed 3.
Up to 3, yes. But that's one approach. I think as we begin to drill in and identify where the short-term rentals in Athens-Clarke County are now, they're going to be where you would expect them to be. They're in the favorable locations that people want to come to Athens and stay. A lot of that's going to be single-family zoned, more than likely. But I think it's going to be kind of across the board. So we need to know that and need to know if there are just certain areas where you feel much more strongly as a committee that you would like to restrict them versus other areas where you feel like they may be more appropriate. And then how do you limit them by area? I know that, and I apologize for missing the last meeting, Savannah, they're set up different, so for them to go in and say, we're going to restrict them as a percentage by ward, they're already set up that way. So it's not easy, but it's easy versus if we tried to do that, we've got to create these places, and you really kind of got to go from county line to county line if you're going to do it. Or begin to just specifically pick out special areas. And I think anytime you start doing that, you're setting yourselves up with more liability from a legal standpoint that they're okay here, but they're not here. And what's the difference? So, it almost, if you went that route, it would probably be something like a commission district. That those are your geographic boundaries. And I'm not sure that's where we want to go, but that is something that other communities have done. And then the issue of vesting, and Sherry's talked a lot about that. That appears to be, from my standpoint, where communities have come in, they've identified, like we have, that our ordinance is silent on it, doesn't talk about it, so you can't do it. And that's kind of been the position of the government. They lose in court generally when they try to do that. If the ordinance is silent on it and you choose to start doing something and there's nothing in our code to say you can't, the courts are typically going to side with property owner. And
We could say that about a lot of stuff.
I say that about a lot of stuff. And so I think that's where you get into the issue of vesting. We went through a vesting process 20 years ago when we adopted the new codes and eliminated the general residential zone. And that was dealing with definition of family as it related to people with investment properties that went from RG to RS. And the way we did that at that point was you were given an opportunity to register your property if it was currently a rental property and you had more than 2 unrelated people in it, as most of them did in RG zones. You were allowed to sell the property. There was a deadline for registration, and then you had a 6-month period of time where you could sell the property and the new owner enjoyed the same rights that you had. Once that 6 months ended, it ran with ownership. And so, on paper, I think it looks good. If I had one of those properties and was renting to 4 and I still own it today, I can still legally rent it to 4. If I sell it to Sherry, she can't. But that is an extremely resource intensive thing to keep up with and track. Generally, where we've had luck with tracking those through the last 2 decades have been in neighborhoods that people knew that property was there and was being rented to multiple people, and it was a grandfathered property. And as soon as the sign goes up, they call us, and we're able to track it that way. But as a percentage of what we're picking up, probably very limited. So, those are some of the issues I think we need to kind of grapple with. They all have challenges, and communities have all done them differently, but that's kind of where I'm coming from as a starting point. And I think we can help. It's just we need a little more information on where y'all want to take this before we dig into it.
Okay, got Mike and this.
So I guess I just want to say this, and I missed it in my last meeting as well. Apologize for that, but kind of did read through the materials and I skimmed your, your brief. But I think, and I can't speak for y'all, but I'm assuming y'all, I just want to see something done. And I don't know what it is, so I guess I could read through your memo and try to pick and choose, but maybe y'all can help us to just come up with some sort of recommendation about what addresses, I think there's got to be some limitation. I think I'd like to see that people are able to do it and actually live here in town, so that, who to call if there is a problem associated with it. I don't know how to enforce them. I don't know I wouldn't even run them in the yard. I guess I'm just saying maybe a recommendation from these guys, since Shears and Austin and Brad have done all the homework on it. Out of all the models you've looked at, what would work best for Athens? That helps.
So Brett, I've been thinking about this a lot in relation to our zoning code and like how we could just use our zoning ordinances to regulate these things. I mean, we have regulations for hotels and even like hotels of certain capacities can't go in certain zones. And I'm just wondering if we could just categorize them as hotels, and use the special use permit, like maybe automatically allow them in all zones if they're, capacity of 2 or 4 people. But anything above that, then they have to go through that kind of process. So there is some vetting, so you can look at each particular site in the context of the neighborhood and the physical built environment of the structure,
It's like a personal care home situation.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there might be some situations where, this home, it's fine if you have, a 4-bedroom 80 or a 4-bedroom B&B in this neighborhood because there's, lots of trees around and it's offset and it's not near any neighbors and whatever. If you want to rent your party house, fine. But there's other situations where you're in tight-knit neighborhoods and you have more than 2 or 4 people coming and going and whooping it up. And, the parking is always an issue in these in-town neighborhoods. Like, I wonder if we just can't use our SUP process and come up with, I mean, I am all for people renting out a bedroom or a garage apartment in their own homes. I feel like that is a really logical thing to do in this day and age, especially when you have like empty nester single parents who all of a sudden have these 4-bedroom homes that they are dealing with. But I think that there's a certain occupancy limit that tends to produce the nuisances.
Special use is interesting. I don't know how that would work with a short term. You make it work. But
Yeah,
you can keep track of it that way.
I think the challenge with use as it relates to number of people is just one, enforcement, and two, unless it is tied to the special use permit, that you're allowed to use this as a short-term rental, but you can only have 4 people there.
Well, it's listed on the website, how many people it sleeps.
Well,
I mean, people could get away with listing it for fewer people, but they can scan that website from time to time.
especially for personal care homes, we don't.
Yeah, I mean, I know there are plenty that would slip between the cracks because people could list them as, this place sleeps 2, but then they'd have a pull-out couch or something, but, there's a little finagling to get at that.
Can't we just put it back on them and bring us something back to look at?
I mean, it's our job.
Sorry,
That was policy. It's
not
what people like elected us. Isn't that, well, I mean, I have constituents that have very specific concerns about this, and I feel like
I do too. and I
bringing
think
it to staff is kind of what we're supposed to be doing.
That's what the people elect us to do.
Yeah.
I think what I'm saying is we can sit here all day long and come up with ideas about what needs to happen, but at the end of the day, it's these folks that are gonna have to tell us what.
Well, I mean, Brad can tell us the viability and Sherry and Austin can tell us the legal viability and practical viability from a planning code standpoint.
Well, and I think what I'm not hearing y'all say is that you just want it to go away.
No.
I'm not hearing that. And so that's kind of step one from my standpoint of, the challenge with these short-term rentals, and it's what we've been talking a lot about and what her memo really digs into is, they're kind of this anomaly from a use standpoint, are they protected under the same protections that people have a right to, live in property? Or are they protected the same way that a hotel? I mean, are there differences to where if we get into challenge legally, is this used from a zoning standpoint different enough than somebody that rents a house, for 6 months at a time to be able to treat it differently, even though they both are people living in structures for a period of time? And that's kind of been the unanswered question, I think, from a legal standpoint. From a pure zoning standpoint, could we come in and say, well, because in order for it to be considered permanent residency, you've got to be there at least 30 days. Anything under, that's where your hotels and motels typically say you can stay in them up to 30 days. And hotels and motels are generally regulated differently in zoning ordinances than our dwellings. If we went to the far right side and said, well, just tweak your definition in the zoning ordinance of hotel to include all short terms, what's going to happen is you're going to make them illegal everywhere except on Atlanta Highway in downtown. And I'm not sure that's what I'm hearing y'all want to do.
I mean, I think we could tweak it so that a definition of a hotel is above, say, 4 occupants or something like that, or everyone sleeps more than 4.
Now, just to really make it even more confusing, because we begin to dig into this, we're going down this road at the same time that there's a real interest in this community on missing middle housing, which kind of flies in
ADUs.
in ADUs. And, and so in one sense, we're talking about missing middle housing and saying, as long as you build it to residential scale, you should be able to build a structure with 4 or 5 units in it in a single family area. But then we're trying to regulate short-term rental in certain areas, and then you get in front of a judge and why is it okay to have a 5-unit building here, but this person lives right next door to him can't rent their ADU in their backyard?
But it's the length of occupancy,
Right, and that's the thing to me and looking through that I don't think has been tested enough in courts. We just don't know.
I mean, I would hope that some of these some of these short-term rentals would convert to missing middle housing. That I would like to see that. It's some of these folks who do have ADUs that they're renting out for B&B. When we allow missing middle, all of a sudden it can be a home for a working Athenian.
Well, some folks will make us $2,000 or $3,000 a weekend renting out these homes.
Yeah.
So they're not-
But it's a lot of work doing it too.
Patrick, what were you thinking? I saw your thing.
So, thank you, Sherry, for that. Lengthy, it was good, it was a good read. I do have just a legal explanation question. You had mentioned long-term rental versus short-term. Is that defined differently from the state or understood differently than the short-term?
Yeah, and I think, again, like Brad said, we don't currently have a definition locally for short-term rentals, and there isn't a state one. But the definition that pretty much everyone is adopting is something less than 30 days. And so when you look at, like, for instance, our definition of family that contemplates long-term residential housing, that definition of family doesn't come into play until after 30 days. So that's why you can have, like, visitors, who are unrelated, who live with you for a week or whatever, but they're not filing that ordinance. So that 30-day cutoff that Brad mentioned is really the difference.
Okay, but it's not really defined anywhere.
No, not in our local ordinances, no.
Okay. And my next question is for Brad. You have mentioned Savannah, so I would like to see, I understand the grandfather, but I'd like to see more STRs in the commercial district and local, we're around downtown, instead of the outskirts in the farm areas. Sister Short can't really mad at me saying that right now, but that'd be grandfather. But can you explain the zoning with Savannah and how we can implement like certain areas in the conflict where you were saying that commission districts and stuff like that?
I think the way historically Savannah was divided up, it gets down into districts and wards, and those wards are all very specific, and so they kind of had a pretty determined geographic boundary set within the city. They then, I think it's 20%, that no more than 20% of the housing units in any given ward could be used for this. And once you get that number and you're the 21st person, you get on a waiting list and you wait for somebody to let theirs either lapse, then you're eligible to get that permit. We're just not really set up that way. We're more by zoning district. One of the things that we've started looking at from just going after it at a zoning standpoint is trying to compare it to existing uses in our ordinance and those that we think we could make an argument are similar. And where those are permitted, maybe, a short-term rental should begin to fall into line with some of those in areas. We've just started looking at that, and, there are lots of issues. And that got down to kind of what I was asking about, and I think I've heard an answer. Maybe we don't, somebody that occasionally wants to rent out, a back bedroom of their house or an ADU in their backyard for a weekend to people may not give you nearly as much heartburn as the person who buys the house and it's never lived in except by people that the neighbors around them have never met, and it turns over regularly.
It depends on how many ADUs are popping up.
It depends on how many, and
it's not gonna help with the affordable housing part of it all.
well, another part that we've never really dug into, but it's something that I want to, and certainly wouldn't be prepared to give you a recommendation today, is legally in the state, can we regulate these at any level in any zoning district based on whether you live on the property or not? Not just to own it, but you live there.
And what does Atlanta do? Doesn't Atlanta do that, or what?
Right, so Atlanta's new ordinance requires that in order to have a short-term rental, you have to list your personal residence first.
Right.
Even if you have no intentions of using your personal residence as an STR. And then after you've registered your first, you can register one additional property, but that's it. And the key thing there is that you have to register your property within the city limits of Atlanta. So by definition, it also means that nobody outside of Atlanta can operate STRs within Atlanta.
Can't we just do the same thing if somebody sues us, they sue us?
Enforcement.
Yeah.
I mean, you certainly could, but the question is whether you're
I
inviting.
mean, I feel like it would be really impractical for
Basically, copy
us.
of Atlanta's.
Yeah, I mean, because we are a very seasonal community, I feel like it'd be really impractical for us to take that approach, because, I know there are professors who maybe are gone for the summer and they rent their Athens house as an ADU in the summer or vice versa.
Well, there's also people like this weekend, I got some emails about somebody who doesn't live in town, just bought a house in Beechwood, and there was a big old party going on.
Yeah, and that's why I feel like capacity is an approach we could take. And spend the special use permit process, because you can take a look at the property and see if it has potential to be a nuisance.
I mean, there may be opportunities for us to dig in and look and talk to some other communities about how they've done it with regard to maybe in our zoning districts that we already allow bed and breakfast, for example, as a permitted use. We allow short-term rentals that aren't restricted to you owning and living there. Get in single family neighborhoods, maybe it's still completely appropriate for you to rent either your whole house for periods of time or an ADU in the backyard, but it's got to be your primary residence, and you've set forth in stipulations on that, and versus just you've got to own property somewhere else in town.
Yeah.
I mean,
I see, so you're treating it, you would be looking at it differently, like, for example, I know they call it Airbnb on Millage Avenue. So that would be treated differently than from in a single family.
single family zoning district right now, you could not do a bed and breakfast. You can out in the AR zone up to 10 bedrooms, and you can in multifamily zones and commercial. And so maybe that's where you begin looking for places where it's by right okay to do short-term rentals without having that primary residence restriction. But if you live in Kingswood and you've got an ADU in your backyard or a guest cottage and you wanted to rent it occasionally, or you wanted to rent your house 3 or 4 football weekends a year, you live there, it would almost be like a home occupation. You're operating a limited business out of your house that you've got to get a permit for, and you've got to get an occupation tax certificate. And we've just started like up here thinking about if that's even viable, but that's kind of where I was thinking with it a little
But
bit.
I think the problem is coming from my perspective, I could be wrong, is not coming from people. Not coming, what you're, the situation that's causing the trouble are people that don't live here.
Right.
And they're just buying the properties and using it for building properties. That's
It's happening a little bit. I got an email this morning, from somebody basically, telling on a friend, on a neighbor, who has been buying up, properties. So they live within Athens-Clarke County, then buying up properties in other neighborhoods and having them be 100% Airbnbs. I mean, so it is happening. I think you're right, especially around the nuisance part, but, I guess I mean, I'm kind of where I get a little bit on some of this though, because, like I am definitely interested in us doing the, special use process, doing that, but that's gonna be, I mean, if we're being honest, that's gonna be years from now, I would think, before we have, right, because we're doing like all the new zoning maps and stuff. I mean, it's gonna be a while before we'd actually get anything done there, probably, if we're gonna go strictly that process. And so I definitely, and why I think I'm happy for us to like discuss things, that I also do think that we need to kind of do something to kind of slow this down. I think that's why we see so many other communities doing it. And I'd definitely be on board for us just to kind of follow what some of the other communities are doing, and definitely look at limiting the number, like Atlanta Green County has done. I understand the concern around if we can limit it just to individuals who live here or have a residence here. But then hopefully we could, write the ordinance in a way that if that was struck down, we could still lean on just the general limit number also, just all the way across.
I think that's an important component, starting in the road, because
Yeah.
if something is going wrong, you need to know who to call. I mean,
Yes, definitely. And all these things also require that too, like when you register it, you're putting down, you have insurance through for this, who is to be reported if you're out of town and stuff like that. You have to put a lot of information on there. And I think the other thing that we like, and I guess the immediate things I'm saying outside of like, I would love to see a recommendation along those lines, but also I'd see like, we just need to work on, a basic definition. And I would like it to see us go ahead and start working on an RFP to have one of these contractors who just scrapes everything, because no matter what direction we go, that is going to
We're
be,
gonna need access.
we have to have that part. And so,
And our recommendation from staff would be, some of these organizations are actually hiring employees to do this work. We're not set up to be able to do that currently with our current staffing, so the system itself would be used for complaints and enforcement. So a neighbor would be reaching out to, the software company that set up this complaint system, and they would be initiating some of
But
the,
doesn't Airbnb do that already, or?
conceivably you can, but that's something that would be much,
yeah.
a much better enforcement if it's handled through a software platform that we're.
And my understanding, the difference like Airbnb is that we do it through one of these companies that software providers, that whenever the complaints come through, so like, my understanding is at least part of the way they do it is if there's a problem house, they'll create like a phone number or an ID. Everybody calls that, and then all the information will come to us.
Yeah.
If Airbnb gets complaints, they'll never send to us. We'll never see it. So,
The other thing I think would be really useful is, we reached out to finance to see how many people had paid the occupancy tax, business tax for short-term rentals. There's not a great way to categorize it because it's in a broad code, but there's only 218 active folks that have paid that in a very broad code that is more inclusive than short-term rentals. So we know that,
It's kind of a lot.
we think that just.
I think it's way more than short-term rentals, so.
Yeah,
what
it is. Yeah, so that's inclusive of all real estate property managers. You know what I'm saying? So there's not a way to code it for short-term rentals, so there's a lot less than 218. And so if we had an enforcement system, that they would know the addresses and we would know the addresses that paid the taxes, and we could enforce the payment of that tax, which could then help pay for that.
and they even do that part, right? I mean, they will actually send out the invoices
Yeah.
and that kind of stuff for us. We don't have to.
What about And we could build the price of that business and the software into the business license fee.
Well, I think we'd have to estimate, but based on, because we don't know the exact number they're paying, it would help definitely offset the price of
Do
that.
we know the number of people that are reporting hotel motel tax from?
You know,
That's another question we've asked finance, and the way they're paying us for the Airbnbs and VRBOs, it's just one line. They don't have to tell us even the number of
Who
people,
doesn't have to tell us? Airbnb?
companies.
They just give us a lump sum.
That's right.
So we don't even know what it is.
Which is why we need the software, so that'll be able to tell us how many active.
Yeah, so we can actually, I mean, I've heard other communities thinking, right, we talked about this last time, is like, a lot of places are assuming that Airbnb is actually underpaying us.
correct.
And so that we find that out too. And
Yeah.
possibly go back to negotiate that a little.
And they could scrape specific data points on the Airbnb listings, like capacity, how many people does each unit list, things like that. So we can regulate it.
So, yeah, I think that cost is easily gonna pay for itself and some. So, I mean, that's why I think to me, that's just one of the obvious things that we need to handle and move forward.
Well, can we ask Sherry and Austin and Brad to come back at the next meeting with a draft ordinance that we can?
Well, what I think I'd say to that is that we really need a little more guidance on what your goals are as far as what you want to achieve, because I think some things are just conflicting in the sense that one of the points is that if we say, and I'm not recommending that we do this, but if we say that you can only operate a short-term rental if you live within Athens-Clarke County, that doesn't actually reduce the number. It just means that you're living here. So I think it would help to kind of have a hierarchy maybe of your concerns, like what are you most interested in? Is it the nuisance? Is it affordable housing, sort of preserving the residential nature of properties? Is it collecting taxes and making sure that folks are paying them? This is something else that I haven't considered. And so if we have kind of a baseline of what you're trying, what your highest priorities are, and maybe a little bit of what your risk tolerance is in terms of, whether you're less or more risk averse, that would help us in identifying ordinances that might get where you want to go.
Yeah, Patrick, and why don't we all try to tackle that a little bit? Because that's how your memo was broken down. I liked that. It was like, there's the nuisance, there's the fee tax collection, there's the limiting the number, there's like limiting where they are. I see, there's like 4 big things and there could be some, so yeah, Patrick, and go over you're saying.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback, what's a good direction to go in. So my big concern is just preserving the neighborhoods, because you keep, I think it keeps the, neighborhood safe, and, people tend to want to buy homes in neighborly neighborhoods where they know their neighbors and stuff like that. But, just these short-term rentals out in the country and just in some of these neighborhoods are becoming very disruptive to the character of neighborhoods. So, I just want to get y'all feedback. But what do y'all, I just want to get your feedback, or just have that dialogue on something like y'all.
Yeah, I mean, that's a primary concern for me, especially in these really tight in-town neighborhoods where they're, increasingly common. We have enough of a problem with student housing, and these are units that are purely there for people to party in a lot of ways. And I feel like that, the more they sleep, the more likely they are to be nuisance properties. You might have a little teeny 1-bedroom cottage that might not even be a viable single family home, quite frankly, and it's not even attractive for student housing, but it could be, just fine for an Airbnb and not be a nuisance property. And that's why I feel like the special use permit or some like capacity limit before any regulation kicks in could be helpful.
I mean, I'll just go and say, like, my biggest priority is, and I agree with the preserving neighborhoods. I think all of these things, most of them would play into that a little bit or help us do that. But my biggest thing is limiting the number is my largest priority. And we were already at, I think it was like 950-ish, I think we saw at the thing last time. That's a lot. That is a whole lot of our housing stock. And it's only going to increase. So limiting the number one. I guess number 2, I would say the fee and tax collection, which again, I think actually kind of comes almost in whatever we do, though, to be honest.
I think that's true.
Yeah. the nuisance part, it is important to me, but I also recognize that we already have code that actually outlaws all the things that we're talking about as nuisances. So I think us creating a different law that's hard to enforce is not gonna actually do anything necessarily with the nuisance part, at least not by itself. I think again, us going with one of these companies will help, because it'll give a direction for people to make complaints that we can kind of.
Yeah, I mean,
pull from.
first thing we need to do is get that
Yeah.
software.
And then the last thing is the limiting where they can be. I am interested in that, but I see that as being extremely challenging. And so my biggest focus is the limiting the number.
Yeah, I see, and as you were saying that, I'm sitting there thinking about, Atlanta, they have one and then two, or you do primary and then two. What if everybody all of a sudden wants Village Heights to be, to rent it? I mean, you can limit the number, but still you're not.
Yeah, they can all be concentrated in one area still.
Right, so
Yeah.
I don't know how they're.
That's why I think the SUP process is.
I don't disagree with the special use process. So you gotta figure out a way to.
Is there interest in limiting the zones, so like the areas, most people?
I'm not interested in limiting the zones. Like, I think it's, I think it could be logical if somebody wanted to rent out top floor of their commercial building I know of one on Chase Street.
Maybe, can you limit the number of times people can rent out? Wasn't there something in one of your memos that somebody does that, like?
Yeah,
Rent it out
yeah,
6 times a year or something?
maybe you,
That was arguing that they were consistent.
Exactly. Like in terms of, have they maintained their grandfathered use, or have they lost it by not using it enough times?
but maybe, like the way I'm looking at it is you get a pass if you live on the property. And maybe you get a pass if the property is only used as a short-term rental for, more than 20% of the year or something like that. But, and the software can figure.
So, Marcus, so I have some people out in the country, the boonies, like families, kids running around, yay, all that type of stuff. The guy lives though with a family who bought like several homes for their kids and stuff, and they all moved off. Now they're STRs. So they're exclusive STRs in these nice neighborhoods, family-oriented neighborhoods, mostly working class, and just football season comes and the neighbors like, oh God, here we go. So that's just my concern.
Yeah, that's why the SUP process, because if you have, they're close to other homes and they're higher capacity occupancy, that's like setting it up for exactly.
I do worry that the SUP process would make it where it's a very elite kind of thing that you can do. That basically all of a sudden somebody who, again, that wanted just to rent their home out for just on game days, make a little bit of
That's
extra
why I
cash
think
for
we could-
Christmas,
We could
that it makes it
give
very
a
difficult.
pass if it's like, under a certain number of days per year. Like the SUP process only kicks in under certain conditions.
Sorry, I wasn't clear. I don't know that it would be appropriate to say that ordinance doesn't come into play if you only do it under a certain number of years. What I was saying is that there's an argument that if someone's saying, oh no, I'm vested, I have the right to do this because I've been doing it for such a long time, we could say, well, no, renting out 2 weekends a year isn't a regular and continuous use. You have not earned that right. But if by ordinance we said this restriction only applies if you rent it out more than 14 days per year, then yes, people who did it less than 14 would not be.
We're not have to worry.
Right.
So what I'm hearing you say, there's all these 140,042 listings have vested rights already.
That's correct.
But what it is, I think the move does lay out pretty well, what would have to be happening for them to keep those vested rights, which is, I think, a bit of a high hurdle of consistency, it seems to me.
They would have to consistently use it, and that's where the definition really gets tricky, is what do we think regular and consistent use is? And as I think I was talking to Josh about this earlier, what we think is regular and consistent use may not be what a court ultimately says is regular and consistent use. We don't have any direction at this point to tell us what that is. One community is saying if you haven't rented out in 7 months, you've given it up. I don't know where they got that number. What's magic about the number 7, but Clearly, some period of time over 6 months and up to a year, you might be able to make that argument that you're just not using it, and so you've lost that right. Certainly, if you sell the property or transfer it in some way, the grandfather right would be gone. Although some places offer like a 6 month grace period to transfer it before. I think you guys did that with
This is making me dizzy.
And we would, well, I think we would need the software company, whoever we went with, to be the tracking agent for how many times a year.
Yeah.
You know, because you're kind of getting into
That's right.
what I heard Commissioner Link just say was that they get a pass if they only do it for 3 or 4 weekends a year. Does that mean if I'm a homeowner and I just happen a couple of weekends a year, I live in town in a neighborhood, and a couple weekends a year, I'd like to go on vacation, I can effectively go for free by renting my house. I only do it twice a year. Do I have to go get a special use to do it twice a year through the commission, or only if you do it? And you're kind of getting into that home ownership versus live in town versus investment property, and they all seem to carry very different stigmas, especially with neighbors and friends across
It's
here.
an investment. I don't know, it just seems to me that.
Yeah,
It's investment, even if it's somebody who lives in town or not, the problem is the problem isn't that if you're doing it just your house every once in a while. That's
Yeah.
right. I think we all agree. That's
yeah. I mean, I know people who have, been able to make ends meet by renting their house out just a couple of weekends, and it's
sure.
saved their ass.
Well, that's why I think like Atlanta possibly hit the best sweet spot that I see, which is you have to own a home in the city of Atlanta, so you have to, and then you are maxed out at only being able to have 2.
I agree.
So that way you're limited to 2. So while you could have 1 investment property, it's limited to 1. And then you also have to be living in the community already.
They can track you down if they're acting
I
up.
think we ought to start there, and if there's a problem, if it continues to be a problem, we can tweak it.
Yeah.
And then get from- Just like Tim said, I mean, it's already.
And we're worried about the number of people with vested rights. The longer we put this off, that's gonna be even more that are grandfathered in.
Yeah, I mean, if we can get something done in the short term that could prevent more and more of these from coming on the market, and especially from like outside investors, because that money's not recirculating in our community. Maybe then work on tweaking it through zoning codes to prevent those nuisances.
So you back away from SUP?
I would love to see that SUP, but it's gonna take some time to work that out, isn't it?
The SUP is not, I mean, it is a fairly strict set of criteria. It's not really like a PD where
Yeah.
I don't want to use the term arbitrary, but there are standards within
Yeah.
the SUP process that if you meet them,
Yeah.
you've got a right to get.
Yeah,
this.
I mean, and noise is one of those standards, and like an overpopulation of a certain use in an area is one of those, there's a list.
Can we work on the Atlanta ordinance while doing an SUP? Is that something, or like,
Mhm.
Can I speak to that very quickly? So sorry. I really have concerns about the special use permit, and I haven't talked to Jed about this, so just kind of talking off the cuff. But I think when we talked about definitions, like, the difference between how finance defines these as like hotel motel, and it's this very broad category. Well, planning, obviously, in our zoning ordinances, we have a lot of different definitions. So we have boarding houses, we have bed and breakfast facilities. And so I think that it's much more, these are much similar to bed and breakfast facilities, and those don't require a special use permit. And so I think it's hard to justify why you would put short-term rentals through this lengthy process, but you wouldn't do the same to like bed and breakfast or guest room lodging type facilities.
Yeah, and that's why I think it would take much longer to go through, because we might have to categorize those.
Yeah.
And that would be something that could be worked through in the whole land use planning process. But if we want to do something in the short term to kind of stop the bleeding,
Yeah, I mean, that's what, I think kind of what you said, Bradford. I mean, not necessarily the special use, but I guess I would like to see a recommendation from staff, and which that's even like basically what the mayor's call was, with kind of basing it around the Atlanta. And I understand there's concerns, but I think the risk is worthwhile there. But while we do that, then possibly it's like, maybe seeing if, planning during the, long-term, work, with, the 5-year review and such. If somewhere in that, y'all just can kind of maybe looked into a zoning approach that could be something that worked either in tandem with the ordinance that we're doing now, or possibly in place of it. But,
Because you don't want it all, like you said, all concentrated on one street or one area.
No,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's a concern that I.
It is.
And- Yeah, and I mean, I feel like the SGP process is like.
Geez, so that would happen. We just end up with short-term rental roads, and there'd be
Yeah, I mean, Hancock, the whole Hancock neighborhood in East Athens would
Yeah.
just be short-term rentals.
If I could just, I would just say that I would just point to the concerns in the memo regarding the Atlanta ordinance, and I think that, I think I've said this last week, but, you know, we have heard specifically from staff in Atlanta, they're anticipating litigation, so that, I mean, I would think they'd be in a position to know, and they're the ones who pushed off enforcement of the ordinance for almost a year now, and have had full compliance, so it may not end up giving you the result that you want.
Mhm.
But I can't guarantee that anything else will either, or won't be challenged either, so
Mm-hmm.
just to be aware of that.
And I will say that looking over the Atlanta ordinance and some of it, I wasn't as convinced that the registration process needed to be as burdensome as what Atlanta had, and looking at what a few other areas had, I think even the Greene County wasn't quite to the same level. So I definitely am not necessarily as interested in like all of that part of it, but to me, more so, and I said before, like I would even be willing to put away with the living in Athens part if we had to, although I think it is a good component if we can have it in there. But to me, really, it'd be just the limiting the two, even if it was saying that for anybody, outside owners, including inside owners, that's the most important thing aspect to me.
Just first, I kind of think though that, and I'm as long as we get something on, I'll be fine with it, but the living in town part is, I think, a strong component for Athens since we have so many.
I think it is just it adds more legal wrinkles to it that I think is.
Well, I can see that, yeah, I see. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's hard to identify a rational basis for why you'd require that. If like a person's able to have a local 24-hour contact person, you know what I mean?
Yeah, but it could be somebody that doesn't answer.
I think we talked about this aspect last, something as well, but Greene County, you know, was a little bit different than Atlanta, where what they're doing is they're getting people to pay the occupancy tax, right, instead of the registration. So I think that's, you know, probably what we would recommend to staff as we pull this together, that you use the software platform that's assessing whether people paid that tax as a way to encourage people to pay it, and then you know how many we actually have.
That definitely needs to be.
Yeah.
The problem is that the Glenn County has nothing to do with the limiting the number of them though.
Right, I'm just saying about Glenn, the registration piece can be
Yes.
handled if you're actually using a software.
Yeah.
platform that has a sense of.
Right, and I'm okay with it. I mean, to me, like again, looking at the land, I was like, some of this is really burdensome with all the stuff that you have to somehow provide and prove and stuff. I could definitely see some folks saying like, I'm just not going to do that and let's screw it around. So I want us to find that line of where it's easy enough to do that people do it, you know, but this is also effective.
Well, the other thing too, and I don't know how the county treats it, but I mean, if you do 1 + 2, then that means 3 occupancy licenses they need to get for all 3 properties, for all 2 properties. You see what
For
I'm
the
saying?
two, right? For individual properties.
I have to talk about it actually.
Because it's
Yeah.
different businesses.
But yeah, sure, yeah, I guess that's probably right.
I mean, they're being operated as different homes.
Right.
Right?
It's McDonald's, that's the difference.
That's true. Yeah, they
Yeah.
just get one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think that would be right for units too. but-
But yeah, so like what you're saying, Jeff, I would be fine with it if that was the registration process was more just channeled through that and the business occupation license without having to add on all of this extra stuff that Atlanta has.
Yeah.
So Brad, any clarifying questions you have? Austin, Brad, Sherry, from what we're hearing right now?
That's something to start with, for sure.
No, I think it does too. So yeah, I'll talk to Judd about some ideas that we've been batting around and then try to get something for our next meeting.
We may have a couple.
Awesome.
Got any more problems we want to solve?
Anybody else have any final comments or direction?
Or solve or create one of them?
Maybe you can ask this, just
Yeah.
so we have time to have the most feedback on the board.
Sure.
And again, this is all extraordinarily sensitive, but how would this body feel if we propose a solution where short-term rentals were limited as a matter of right to certain zones,
Mhm.
but you also could have them in your primary residence? So for example,
Mm-hmm.
maybe they're not allowed in residential zones like RS itself, unless it's in your primary residence. But they otherwise might be allowed in, say, like commercial downtown, like for condos.
So much is about minus the percentage.
Right, it would, yeah, it would be, we were talking about it as kind of a creative way to come at it from different approaches, but I'm just curious if that's an idea that you would even be interested in entertaining, or if, because I got the vibe earlier that there was definitely no interest really
This
by
guy,
zoning.
I am interested in entertaining that, but you know, I kind of would like to see that SUP process where there might be certain situations where you have a house on, you know, your family's rural 20 acres that you want to keep the property, but nothing's going on with the house.
I think it's kind of like what you would do with an SUP process in that light would be typically special uses move into zoning classifications when they begin to become marginal versus other uses that are already permitted by right, which is why Sherry correctly talked about you wouldn't want to make a short-term rental in an RM1 zone, a special use permit, but I can do a 10-bedroom bed and breakfast right next door to it.
Yeah,
But a 15-bedroom bed and breakfast in RM1 is a special use because you're getting to a size now where
yeah,
it
yeah.
needs further consideration and maybe
yeah, where
maybe
the,
a special use there's an opportunity, for example, in RS zones for owner occupied property to do something. But if you want to do more than that, it's a special use
Yeah,
permit or it is something different.
that's where I'm going, where there's a certain criteria where the special use permit kicks in.
Like, I can see what you're saying is, like what Sherry's saying, I don't mind if game day does.
Right.
Right.
The entire thing.
Right. But if if somebody owns a home somewhere, they can rent it out if it's their primary residence. And maybe if they need, and if they want an additional one, they have to go through a special use process to do that.
Or you're saying, or you're just saying, and just saying it's limited to certain zones, which would be like an easy approach for us. Yeah, I mean, I'm fine with this, and you can do it anywhere in your own home. But then if you want to have an additional, it can only be done in commercial zones, downtown, or whatever else you want to. I think that would, right, that would limit the number.
It's stronger than Atlanta's.
Or maybe even if you wanted
Yeah.
a second on your property, you know, I want the right to rent my house under this provision, but I also want to build an ADU in the backyard, rent it too. Well, now I got two going on. That maybe that triggers, you know, if I want to do that, I've got to go through a special use permit process versus if I just want to do one on my property that I live in within these parameters,
Yeah.
I go get a permit and I do it and I pay my taxes and I go on down the road.
Well, and I think if they, having it in their own home and,
Probably not going to do the party house.
yeah, they're not going to do the party house. But if they do want to do an additional one somewhere else, going through the special use allows us to make sure they don't get concentrated and, that they don't. Because I could see, somebody doing that, Brad, building an ADU on the back and all of a sudden
You've got two.
20 people.
Right.
I don't agree with Yeah.
The other risk of a special use process, I just don't know of any community that's taking that tack. It doesn't mean it can be done, it may be because it's faster to do these other processes, but I don't have a good example I can pull out right now. Yeah, that's like that.
Mhm.
But we have our intern working on that, and he's giving me some summaries, so we're gonna try to see what we can pull from other communities.
And maybe just where we start before getting into that part would just be like kind of what you're suggesting, which is you can do it in your own home, and we could say you can do it in commercial, which I don't think any of us will have concerns if it was happening commercial. But then anything else beyond that, including as an ADU, maybe that just won't be allowed right now until we figure out another process such as special use process or something.
So the commercial, would the ground floor commercials still apply? The residential aspect would have to be on the upper floors. Could they, like, could somebody like
Couldn't-
buy the grit and turn it into an Airbnb?
It's either going to classify as another otherwise permitted
You have to
use,
charge a
or
lot
it
for
would have
that.
to be in a unit
That's the
above.
money.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to make sure that it sticks to, you know, your traditional residential upper floor.
Where it would tend to initially, at the first blush, shake out is the owner occupancy requirement would fall in your single-family zoning districts. Once you get into your multifamily zoning districts, even though there are still single-family houses in those multifamily zones, you could also go right next door by right and build a 10-bedroom
Right.
Airbnb. So probably don't need to restrict those to the owner occupancy like we are in the single-family zones.
So at this point, we're probably saying that it would just be limited in single family.
Be limited in single family, and then you would establish criteria.
I mean, you've
for your
already got
definition
street
for other.
houses in those RM zones.
I mean, it's what you're saying too, the owner can rent them out and just not, are you saying they need to stay there during the weekend or?
I mean, I would think as long as it's a homestead exempted property that they, you know.
But they don't have to be there while it's being rented out.
Sure, right, right,
Necessarily.
right, yeah.
There's no way to control that.
I mean, yeah, if it's a homestead
Yeah.
exemption,
It's gonna be
you're saying that is your primary residence.
Right,
So-
that's what, we were trying to be a little bit more broad when we were thinking this sort of primary residence, because we wanted to include tenant occupant.
Sure.
I don't know how you all feel about that, but that was something we were trying.
Say, tenant,
The idea that, someone who's a tenant, who isn't paying property taxes, who obviously isn't gonna have a homestead exemption, that they could still rent out their property.
Okay, okay.
Just, for example, right now, a tenant in a house, if they want to set up a side consulting business and they rent a house in Kingswood, they can go get a home
like
like,
Kingswood lot.
they can get a, no, it's just easy, because I'm late at you, but, you know, we do them all the time. They're called home occupation permits. It allows you to do a small business out of your house. You can't have a sign. You can only use so much of your house. But if you're a tenant and not the owner, you also have to bring in a letter of approval from the owner
Okay.
saying that they agree to allow you to operate this business. And my guess is the likelihood of a landlord who's renting property to somebody, letting them sublease on weekends is not likely. But
It's happening, but
But in
they
order-
probably want to stop.
But in order to be fair and be equitable from a zoning and land use standpoint, I think you've got to allow both.
Yeah.
Under certain provisions.
That'd be fine.
I think we should start there and see where it goes.
Yeah, I think it's a good approach.
Thank you.
Well, team effort,
Yeah.
we've been trying to put our thinking hats on, so we'll continue to vet those ideas and come back to you with more information if it pans out.
Okay. Awesome. Anything else, everybody?
To adjourn.
Okay, is there a second?
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, we are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
Thank y'all.
Very helpful conversation.